You've been lied to about what makes a man truly fulfilled, and the proof is walking around everywhere you look. Married men who gave up their dreams, their independence, and their potential for what society promised would be happiness. Immanuel Kant, arguably the most brilliant philosopher who ever lived, saw through this deception and made a choice that scandalized his era, but reveals a profound truth about masculine strength and rational living, while lesser men chase validation. Through romance, Kant discovered something that will fundamentally change how you think about relationships, success, and what it really means to live as a complete human being. What he understood about the nature of love, commitment, and individual purpose will either liberate you from society's expectations or make you deeply uncomfortable about the choices you've already made. Immanuel Kant spent his entire life pursuing one thing above all else: pure rational thought. This man who revolutionized philosophy and gave us the foundations of modern ethics never once allowed his heart to override his mind. When it came to marriage, Kant faced what he considered the ultimate test of his philosophical principles. Here was an institution that demanded he surrender his rational judgment to the chaos of human emotion. For a man who believed that reason should guide every decision, marriage represented a dangerous compromise that could destroy everything he had built. The philosopher understood something that most men never realize until it's too late: romantic love is fundamentally irrational. It makes you act against your own interests, clouds your judgment, and forces you to make decisions based on temporary feelings rather than permanent principles. Kant watched as brilliant men around him became shadows of themselves after marriage, abandoning their goals and dreams for the sake of domestic harmony. He saw how the intense emotions of love could transform logical, ambitious individuals into reactive, dependent beings who could no longer think clearly about their own lives. This wasn't mere cynicism on Kant's part, it was a profound philosophical insight. He recognized that marriage asks you to base one of life's most important decisions on the most unreliable foundation possible: your emotions. While society tells you that love conquers all, Kant knew that emotions are temporary, unpredictable, and often destructive. The man who could dissect the nature of reality itself refused to let something as volatile as romantic feelings determine his life's direction. He chose the path of reason over the path of passion, and in doing so, he revealed a truth that most men never want to face. Kant's most famous principle, the categorical imperative, states that you should only act according to principles you could make universal laws. When he applied this test to romantic relationships, he discovered something disturbing. Most of what we call love is actually disguised selfishness. Think about it honestly. When you pursue a woman, aren't you primarily focused on what she can do for you, how she makes you feel, what status she brings, how she satisfies your needs? Kant realized that this kind of motivation fails his moral test completely. The categorical imperative demands that you treat people as ends in themselves, never merely as means to your own satisfaction. But romantic relationships are built on using another person to fulfill your emotional, physical, and social needs. You want her beauty, her companionship, her validation. She wants your resources, your protection, your commitment. Both parties are essentially using each other, which violates the fundamental principle of moral action. Kant saw through the romantic mythology that disguises this mutual exploitation as something noble and pure. This insight explains why so many relationships turn toxic over time. When the initial passion fades and people stop getting what they want from each other, the underlying selfishness becomes obvious. Partners become demanding, manipulative, and resentful because the relationship was never really about moral love. It was about mutual utility. Kant understood that true moral behavior requires you to act from duty, not desire. And romantic relationships are fundamentally driven by desire rather than ethical principle. For Kant, freedom wasn't just a political concept, it was the very essence of human dignity. He believed that your ability to think and act independently defines your worth as a rational being. Marriage, in his view, represented the voluntary surrender of this fundamental freedom. When you marry, you agree to let another person's needs, desires, and opinions influence your major life decisions. You can no longer pursue your goals without considering how they affect your spouse. Your time, energy, and resources become shared, property rather than tools for your own development. Kant observed how married men gradually lose their sense of individual purpose. They stop taking risks, avoid pursuing ambitious projects, and begin making decisions based on domestic stability rather than personal growth. The philosopher saw this as a form of intellectual and spiritual death. Marriage doesn't just limit your external choices, it reshapes your internal world. You start thinking like half of a couple instead of a complete individual. Your dreams get filtered through the lens of what's acceptable to your partner, and your identity becomes tied to your role as a husband rather than your own achievements. The tragedy, according to Kant, is that most men don't realize what they've lost until it's too late. They trade their autonomy for the illusion of security and companionship. But true security comes from self-reliance, and real companionship requires two independent individuals choosing to share their lives, not to people who've merged into a single, diminished entity. Kant chose to remain free rather than become a prisoner of domestic obligation. Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative contains a principle that destroys most people's romantic fantasies. Never treat another person merely as a means to an end, but always as an end in themselves. When he examined marriage through this lens, he discovered something that shocked even him. The institution of marriage, despite all its noble rhetoric, essentially involves two people agreeing to use each other for their own purposes. You marry someone because of what they bring to your life, not because of who they are independent of you. Consider what marriage actually involves: exclusive sexual access, emotional support, domestic services, social status, and often financial benefits. Both partners enter the contract expecting specific returns on their investment. The woman wants security, resources, and commitment. The man wants beauty, companionship, and sexual availability. This is fundamentally a transaction where human beings become commodified. Kant saw this as a profound violation of human dignity, because it reduces complex individuals to the functions they serve in your life. The philosopher understood that genuine respect for another person means valuing them for their own sake, not for what they can do for you. But marriage makes this impossible because the relationship exists precisely to serve mutual needs. When your spouse stops fulfilling their expected role, the relationship breaks down. This proves that the connection was never really about them as a person, it was about them as a provider of services. Kant refused to participate in this dehumanizing system because it contradicted his deepest moral convictions. Kant built his entire philosophy on one revolutionary idea: moral actions must come from duty, not from inclination or desire. This principle creates a massive problem for romantic relationships because they are fundamentally driven by what you want rather than what you ought to do. When you pursue a woman because you find her attractive, exciting, or comforting, you're acting from desire. When you stay in a relationship because it feels good, you're following inclination. Neither of these motivations meets Kant's standard for moral behavior. True moral duty requires you to act according to principles that could apply to everyone, regardless of personal feelings. But romantic love is intensely personal and selective. You don't love someone because they deserve it according to universal principles. You love them because they trigger specific emotions in you. This makes romantic relationships inherently selfish and morally questionable. Kant recognized that desire is a terrible foundation for important life decisions because it changes constantly and serves your own interests rather than objective moral law. The conflict between duty and desire explains why so many relationships become sources of moral compromise. You find yourself lying to keep the peace, sacrificing your principles to maintain harmony, or acting against your better judgment to satisfy your partner. Kant saw this pattern and refused to put himself in a position where his desires could override his moral duties. He chose to live according to rational principles rather than emotional impulses, understanding that desire makes slaves of even the strongest men. Kant possessed something that most men lack: the ability to see through society's most powerful illusions. While everyone around him celebrated romantic love as life's highest achievement, he recognized it as one of humanity's most dangerous delusions. Romantic love promises eternal happiness, perfect understanding, and complete fulfillment through another person. Kant understood that these promises are not only false, but actively harmful, because they prevent men from developing genuine self-reliance and inner strength. The illusion works by convincing you that you're incomplete without a romantic partner. Society teaches you that finding the right woman will solve your problems, heal your wounds, and give your life meaning. This mythology keeps men in a perpetual state of emotional dependence, always searching for external validation rather than building internal worth. Kant saw how this illusion makes men weak, desperate, and willing to compromise their values for the possibility of romantic fulfillment. He watched intelligent men make terrible decisions because they believed in the fantasy of transformative love. What makes this illusion particularly dangerous is that it feels so real. When you're experiencing it, the chemical rush of attraction, the intoxication of new romance, the sense of finally finding your missing piece, all of these feelings seem to validate the myth. But Kant knew that feelings are not facts. He understood that temporary emotional states cannot provide lasting fulfillment, and that building your life around someone else's presence is a recipe for eventual disappointment and resentment. Kant believed that reason was humanity's greatest gift and most reliable guide for making important decisions. When he observed how people approached romantic relationships, he was horrified to see intelligent individuals abandoning rational analysis in favor of emotional impulses. Think about how most men choose their partners. They feel attracted, experience chemistry, enjoy the excitement, and then commit to lifelong arrangements based on these temporary sensations. Kant recognized this as fundamentally irrational behavior that would be laughable in any other context. Imagine making any other major life decision the way people choose romantic partners. Would you buy a house because it gave you butterflies? Would you choose a career because it made your heart race? Would you invest your life savings based on how something made you feel in the moment? The absurdity becomes obvious when you apply emotional decision-making to other areas of life. Yet when it comes to relationships, society not only accepts, but celebrates this irrational approach as romantic and authentic. Kant understood that emotions are temporary, unreliable, and often misleading indicators of what's actually good for you. What feels exciting today might become boring tomorrow. What seems passionate now might turn destructive later. Rational analysis considers long-term compatibility, shared values, practical considerations, and realistic expectations. But most people skip this analysis entirely because it feels unromantic. Kant chose to apply the same logical standards to relationships that he applied to everything else, which naturally led him away from the emotional chaos of romantic entanglement. Kant was a master at analyzing social contracts and understanding how institutions serve the interests of those in power. When he examined marriage, he saw it as a cleverly designed system that benefits society at the expense of individual men. Marriage creates stable economic units, produces the next generation of workers, and keeps men focused on domestic responsibilities. Rather than potentially disruptive pursuits, society promotes marriage as a personal choice, but Kant recognized it as social engineering designed to control male energy and ambition. The manipulation works through a combination of shame and promise. Men who remain unmarried are labeled as immature, selfish, or incomplete. Meanwhile, marriage is presented as the ultimate achievement and source of happiness. This creates enormous social pressure to conform to an arrangement that primarily serves collective interests rather than individual welfare. Kant observed how married men become more compliant employees, more predictable citizens, and less likely to challenge existing power structures because they have families to support and domestic obligations to maintain. What makes this manipulation particularly effective is that it disguises social control as personal fulfillment. Men genuinely believe they're choosing marriage for their own happiness, not recognizing how thoroughly they've been conditioned to want something that limits their potential. Kant saw through this conditioning because he always asked who benefits from any social arrangement. The answer revealed that marriage serves society's need for stability and control much more than it serves men's need for growth and self-actualization. Kant believed that every rational being has a unique purpose that can only be fulfilled through individual development and achievement. He saw his own mission clearly: to understand the nature of reality, establish the foundations of moral philosophy, and contribute something meaningful to human knowledge. This kind of singular focus requires complete dedication, unlimited time for reflection, and the freedom to pursue ideas wherever they lead. Marriage, in his view, would have diluted this focus and compromised his ability to fulfill his philosophical destiny. The problem with couple goals is that they represent a compromise between two different visions rather than the pure expression of either person's individual purpose. When you merge your life with someone else, your dreams get filtered through their limitations, fears, and competing priorities. Your partner might not understand your mission, support your risks, or share your willingness to sacrifice comfort for achievement. Kant recognized that greatness requires the kind of single-minded dedication that partnership naturally undermines. Most men never discover their individual purpose because they get distracted by relationship goals. Before they've done the deep work of self-discovery, they focus on being good boyfriends or husbands instead of becoming great men. They measure success by relationship milestones rather than personal achievements. Kant understood that you can't contribute something unique to the world if you're constantly trying to balance someone else's needs with your own vision. He chose to remain true to his individual mission rather than compromise it for the sake of companionship. Kant's approach to relationships offers a blueprint for men who want to escape the emotional chaos and poor decisions that plague modern dating. The first principle is to make decisions based on reason rather than attraction or chemistry. Before pursuing any woman, ask yourself rational questions. What are her actual character traits beyond physical appearance? How does she handle stress, conflict, and responsibility? What are her long-term goals, and how do they align with yours? This logical evaluation prevents you from getting swept up in temporary emotions that lead to permanent mistakes. The second Kantian principle is to maintain your individual identity and mission regardless of your relationship status. Never compromise your core values, abandon your goals, or sacrifice your personal development for the sake of keeping someone happy. A relationship that requires you to become less than your best self fails Kant's moral test. Instead of seeking validation through romance, focus on building the kind of life that attracts quality people naturally. When you're complete as an individual, you don't need another person to fulfill you. Finally, apply Kant's categorical imperative to every relationship decision. Ask yourself whether your behavior represents principles you could universalize. Are you being honest, treating the other person with genuine respect, and acting from moral duty rather than selfish desire? This framework eliminates the manipulation, games, and emotional dysfunction that characterize most modern relationships. By following Kant's rational approach, you can either find genuine partnership or discover, like he did, that independence offers greater fulfillment than compromise. Kant's decision to remain unmarried wasn't the choice of a man who couldn't find love. It was the deliberate decision of someone who understood that true strength comes from within, not from another person. He recognized that most men sacrifice their potential on the altar of romantic fantasy, trading their individual greatness for the illusion of completeness through partnership. The question you must ask yourself is this: are you living according to your own rational principles, or are you allowing society's expectations and your own emotional impulses to dictate the most important decisions of your life? If this philosophical journey has challenged your assumptions about relationships and personal fulfillment, subscribe to this channel for more insights that will help you think clearly about the choices that define your existence.